Welcome to this first session of the CPG Administrators and Church Leaders Education Webinar Series. Today's presentation involves the church insurance companies that manage our property, casualty, and liability insurances, plus a number of other important services. We welcome today's presenters, Steve Folos, General Manager for Church Insurance, and Paul Stevens, Vice President for Marketing and Risk Management for Church Insurance. Welcome, Steve and Paul. All right,
Thank you, Jermaine.
you got it. Just want to let everyone know this webinar series is hosted by IBAMS, otherwise known as Integrated Benefits Account Management Services. Steve and Paul, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Jermaine. I will get us started just with a brief overview of exactly how we got into this business and some of the basics of risk management. I'll turn it over to Paul for him to review. I'm not seeing your screen, Jermaine, so are you on the slide that says the mission of the company?
We are going to be right now.
Great. All right. The mission of the company was started in 1929 outside of the pension fund by J.P. Morgan's son, and the mission of the company was that we would reduce the cost of insurance to the churches, by handling losses in a sympathetic and tactful way, considering the best interests of the church, which a for-profit company may not always have our best interest in mind. And it was, the hope that with our specialized knowledge of our own church, we would have a broader and better product to offer the churches than they could find in the marketplace. The company was turned over to the pension fund in the 1930s. We took it over at that time, and really the mission today has not changed very much from what it was originally. That same concept that the church has a different moral hazard than other types of risks, other businesses that might be insured through an insurance company. We thought we could do a little bit better job by having our own program that serves the church. Again, hopefully when you're calling in your claims, you're finding a sympathetic person on the other end that is happy to take your information and not telling you to call back when you have your policy number or when it's more convenient. Hopefully we're setting expectations and really giving some thought to how claims are handled and losses are taken care of. And again, Jermaine, I'm not seeing your screen, so I'm going to church insurance companies. The three companies. Church Insurance Company, as I said, was formed in 1929 to insure really just fire at that time, and then it's grown into obviously much more over time. CIAC, which is the service provider or the agency, was formed in 1930. That is formed to, as I said, to provide services, but also there are lines of coverage like automobile, for example, or workers' compensation that church insurance does not underwrite themselves. They use a business partner to write those lines. Those are lines that you have to be a licensed agent to write, and that's why we have the Church Insurance Agency Corporation. Church insurance, I think the history here is that church insurance worked wonderfully for years as a fire insurance company. I don't think it was until really the 1960s that we started to write liability coverage. But as the church expanded and you had more extension ministries and different types of liability risks, sexual misconduct that we mentioned in the agenda, directors and officers coverage for the vestry as individuals, your employment practices, lawsuits for wrongful termination, things like that. It really was expanded. And as we put things on our own licensed company and church insurance company, the original company, the cost was really starting to get overwhelming. And we formed what's called a captive insurance company. It was formed in 1999. The first diocese went into that company in 2001. A pure captive, or what's referred to as a single parent captive insurance company. It used to be really, they were mostly offshore for the longest time. Vermont really became the leader in captive insurance, the way maybe a Delaware is for banking. Companies, most of the Fortune 500 companies, if they were large enough in scope, they took on their own insurance company, really for the advantages of premium tax and some others that I'll talk about on the next slide. So Jermaine, I'm going to go to the slide entitled, "What is church insurance?" Again, there are risk retention groups that you will see, which would be medical malpractice. You will see a group of doctors get together and form a company. There are group captives, which are similar types of risk forming a company. In that case, we see it with maybe contractors. They all pay in a certain amount of capital. They all have a seat on the board of directors. They all have a say in how something is managed. That is a group captive. We are a pure captive, or a single parent captive. That meaning we only insure our own properties. We only have Episcopal churches, dioceses, and missions inside of our own company. And then, of course, the parent to the organization is the church pension group. The tax-exempt model for the captive, really, you're looking at about 3 points in terms of the tax on $60 to $70 million of written premium over the last couple of years. 3% is a significant number that we can pass back down to the churches in the way of lower premiums. I would say a common meeting at clergy conferences is, hey, the plate is down and the premiums keep going up. What things can you do to hold the line on premiums so we don't see more than an inflationary type increase? And this is one way to do so. And then, of course, the agency we talked about a little bit. We are a call center. We follow the sun, so you can call an 800 number, get proof of insurance if you're purchasing a new building, a summary of coverage, billing questions, how to submit a claim, etc. And then we provide risk management services, which Paul will talk about in the next few slides. Jermaine, I'm going to using a captive insurance company for the Episcopal Church and its advantages. We only need to be licensed in the state of Vermont as a captive. That's a big advantage from the licensed company, church insurance. I should have mentioned the church insurance still does exist, church insurance company. That company is domiciled in New York. It sits in New York. It has a significant surplus. And the reason is because we still have legacy claims for things like sexual misconduct. An example, you can have repressed memory, and we have claims from the 80s and 90s, really as far back as the 60s. We may see them, and that surplus sits there to take care of those losses that might have occurred previously. However, a licensed admitted carrier like church insurance has to be licensed admitted in all 50 states, and there's a tremendous advantage to just having things approved in one state and being able to write them in all 50. Large reduction in expense in terms of compliance, as you can imagine, not having to file every form and having it approved in every state. Policies being written in the name of Church Insurance Company of Vermont. Basically what that means is that We can also take what were maybe 7 different lines of coverage. Of course, there were 7 different bills. They were all due at different times. Billed quarterly, you had about 28 different bills at one time for all the different lines, such as umbrella coverage, your boiler and equipment, your crime coverage, which covers absconding, really directors and officers, employment practices. They were all on separate policies. By putting them into a captive program, they can all be placed into one package of coverage. Obviously, administrators like that, if you're with church insurance, it's not a la carte. It's all in there in one package, and the administrators know that you have a breadth of coverage specifically for liability. You have the adequate protection for those lines. The other thing I will say is that, we have moved a couple times from Swiss reinsurance to general reinsurance to Lloyd's of London. You don't see that. That is really behind the scenes because it's on church insurance paper. The way the market would work is every time, the directors and officers was changed or the umbrella carrier. I remember when I first got started here, the July 1st umbrella was canceled by a carrier we won't name. We found out about it on July 3rd. That they had canceled everything July 1st. We were scrambling to find umbrella coverage for 2,000 churches without any notice. Something like that you just wouldn't see in the captive. We take the first part of the risk, the primary part, and then we've got our business partners, our reinsurers behind that. And again, the ability to use the same product countrywide. We just, for example, updated our hurricane deductibles so that they're consistent from Galveston to Kennebunkport. Everybody has a 2% hurricane deductible, and on the East Coast, I should say. And it's nice to be able to treat everybody with the same coverage and same product. But at the same time, we can change product features very quickly. We'll come out, meet with the insurance department here in Vermont, and there have been times that we've had our business plan approved within a week of submitting it, and then we're allowed to, let's say we want to change the flood coverage and we want to increase it or decrease it. We file it with the state of Vermont, they approve it, and then we can put it on every diocesan renewal as it comes on, rather than having to apply to each individual state. And lastly, we talked a little bit about the premium taxes. It is roughly, we pay about 0.5% to the state of Vermont, where the average state would be about 3.5% if we were an admitted company. So there's some premium savings there. So really, being a captive was a fit for us in a number of ways. We felt it was the best way to serve the church and then to really run lean and keep down our expenses. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul Stevens. Paul is the Vice President of Risk Management for the organization, and he will take you through a handbook that we put together for churches. Paul?
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Jermaine, you can take me to the next slide. Now that Steve's covered the company history and the basics of captive insurance, what I'm going to do the rest of the day is take you through our agenda with the goal of highlighting the coming attractions in our next 3 webinars, which will occur in May, June, and July. But before we do that, I want you to take note and to download a free copy of our Safety and Insurance Handbook for Churches. I think you'll find this a nice supplement as we move through the upcoming webinars. This is a very useful ebook. It contains over 100 pages of helpful information covering the many coverages and aspects of property and casualty insurance. One of the features I really like is it has a searchable index at the back of the book that allows you to quickly locate items of interest, so you're not wading through pages looking for an item. It takes you right to it. So, for example, someone asks you what's employment practices liability, you could go to the index, click on that, it would take you right to that section. So it's a really helpful tool. We really like it a lot, and we encourage you to download a copy, keep it on your desktop, share it widely. And I'll leave this up on the screen for just a moment so you can take note of where you can download this. And if you have problems, just reach out to us at the 800 number, and we can always get that to you or send us an email through the webinar. Okay. So now on to the coming attractions for the webinar series. Next slide, please, Jermaine. And the next slide. Okay. So May 16th, what you're going to see over May, June, and July is we're going to take the various aspects of property and casualty, and we're going to break them down into some subsets, sections that we can focus on. This stuff gets to be a little deep, so trying to combine it all into one webinar would not necessarily be the best approach. So what you'll see here, May 16th, we will focus strictly on property coverage. And we will include a claims overview in that presentation, which really kind of helps to take all that information and put it to use in a real live example. Property coverage review, we'll look at things like the perils of coverage. What is covered, meaning causes of loss, things like fire, windstorm, etc. We will look at the limits of property coverage. What is the value established for a building or buildings for personal property within such buildings? We will go through the various deductibles that may apply to a property coverage. It can be anything from your typical all other property deductible, which typically would apply to things like fire, but you may be in a region or have a coverage like earthquake that has a percentage deductible, or be in a region that's susceptible to hurricane that has a percentage deductible. And we'll break into all those and break that out for you. Valuation as it relates to property coverage. And what we'll be getting into pretty extensively there is the work that Church Insurance Agency does every 5 to 7 years, where we go out and calculate the replacement cost value of every insured building. We're currently in the process of that, about halfway through this time around. This includes over 18,000 insured buildings. This is one of the bedrocks of insurance. You want to make sure you have the right property limit when you do have the claim so that the building can be put back the way you want it and the way that it was. So we'll spend quite a bit of time on valuations. We'll talk a little bit with relation to property coverage as it relates to extensions of coverage. Within the property policy that is provided by Church Insurance, there are several extensions of coverage or add-ons. Some of these would be business income and interruption coverage, sewer backup coverage, fine arts coverage, flood coverage, and we'll break into those and speak to those to a certain degree in a drilled down session, again, May 16th. We'll speak about equipment breakdown. This is sudden accidental loss to, it can be boilers, steam boilers, sudden and accidental steam explosion, but more than likely nowadays most of it is sudden and accidental electrical arcing to HVAC equipment, telephone systems, computer systems. And we'll finish up the property review talking about a new coverage for all of us, which unfortunately is a necessary aspect today, and it's called malicious attack coverage. Malicious attack coverage is automatically provided to any insured who has a package policy with Church Insurance Company. What a malicious attack means is it's an event that occurs during the policy period, involves the use of a weapon, a vehicle, explosive device, held hand weapon. So this is a whole new aspect of property coverage that we'll break into when we get to the webinar on May 16th. Once we're done reviewing the property coverage, we will get into some risk management and property maintenance basics, some helpful hints, suggestions, again, much of which is in the ebook that I mentioned earlier, where the church can do all that they can do to try to avoid or reduce a loss, and then also some focus on property maintenance, some of the most important aspects being the roofs and the foundations of buildings, the structural integrity of buildings, and life safety issues. The last thing we'll do on May 16th as part of our property coverage and claims overview is the actual claims case study. We'll bring in one of our claims leaders who will take us through a case to show us how the case, what was the loss and how the coverage addressed the loss and the result of the claim. And that will conclude May 16th's webinar, which again will focus on property coverage. Next slide, please, Jermaine. Our June 13th webinar, we will take a look at strictly liability coverage, again with a claims overview. Liability coverage, again, has nothing to do with the building, so to speak. This is about liability. This is about lawsuits and litigation protecting the church in the event of such events. We'll break it into insuring agreements, what is covered. Again, we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at the various limits of liability coverage. The per occurrence limit, the general aggregate limit, the difference between claims made coverage and occurrence coverage. The liability coverage is a broad form, meaning it covers, the way it covers things is unless otherwise excluded. So we'll drill down into that a little bit so that folks have an understanding of the depth of the coverage. We'll speak quite a bit about the church-specific type of coverages, things like sexual misconduct, things like pastoral counseling, along those lines. One of the bigger exposures that all churches have, whether they know it or not, is the hired and non-owned auto exposure. And we'll spend quite a bit of time identifying it, thinking about that as a group, and speaking to how it's covered and the limits associated with it. We'll spend some time speaking about what is many times called an umbrella. I like to call it excess liability. It's an extra layer of liability coverage that every policyholder with church insurance has at least $1 million of excess liability. We'll talk about why it's important, what it is, what it covers. We will talk about another new coverage that has come into our portfolio, which is called cyber liability. Cyber liability provides first and third-party insurance for covered cyber losses. We'll get into the details of that, but at a high level, it provides coverage for multimedia, $250,000 per limit, security and privacy liability, any fines or regulatory fees that you might have to pay for a breach, as well as any cost up to $250,000 for losing things like credit card numbers and bank accounts. These are things that we actually have seen a couple claims along these lines, but it's new to us and probably new to you and something we'll spend some time on. Lastly, we'll talk about workers' compensation, which is a coverage that is not provided directly from church insurance, but as Steve mentioned, through a product partner who's licensed specifically to do workers' compensation. Church insurance agency acts as the agent. We'll speak to workers' compensation, what it is, who it covers, what the limits look like. When we're finished with our liability coverage review, again, June 13th, we will do a risk management liability maintenance walkthrough. Again, looking at the low-hanging fruit of liability. What can a church or school or any Episcopal organization do to avoid and reduce losses and exposures? And some of that will involve the building, because obviously buildings can hurt folks, but a lot of it will get into maybe even things like hold harmless agreements, things like that, that are more litigation centered. Lastly, we'll do a liability claims case study where, again, we'll bring in one of our claims leaders who will outline a real-life liability case, showing us what the cause of the loss was, what the limits were, how the policy responded, and the outcome of that claim. And we find that if you put a real-life case with it, it helps people to really kind of retain the information a little better. That's on June 13th, and that's the liability coverage and claims overview. Next slide, please, Jermaine. Finally, on July 25th, the webinar will cover directors and officers, employment practices liability, sexual misconduct coverage, along with a claims overview. Very popular topic when we're meeting with vestries around the country. When we start to speak about directors and officers coverage, employment practices coverage, ears perk up vestries realize that this is providing coverage that protects them against losses to their personal assets while they're serving in their position of leadership for the church. So we'll drill into what is directors and officers. We'll talk about examples of claims with directors and officers. And while directors and officers is an issue and it's something that we always want to provide protection for, we will quickly move into the area of employment practices liability. Of the two coverages, it's by far the exposure where we see the most activity. These are things like I wasn't hired, I was fired, I was sexually harassed by another employee, and the one we see the most is wrongful termination. And we'll think about what are our human resource guidelines at the local church? What does that look like? Are there job descriptions? Are there annual reviews? Food for thought about how to lower our exposure to that type of litigation. And then, unfortunately, but necessary, we will spend a lot of time talking about sexual misconduct coverage. We'll probably dovetail a little bit into safeguarding God's children as it relates to sexual misconduct and protecting children in our care, and a liability coverage review. So again, we'll get into all the insuring agreements. We'll do a drill down into the three major coverages. At the end of that, we will do a case study of a real-life claim situation, and we'll bring in one of our liability experts who will outline a case that was impacting one or more of these coverages, and that will be on July 25th, the webinar for D&O, EPL, and SM coverage. Next slide, please. That concludes an overview from the agenda, and I know there's a lot of information there, and hopefully it served as a really good coming attractions for you folks. Some may find, hey, I'm a school, I don't own any buildings, but I'm really interested in that liability and directors and officers portion, and you may want to join us for those. Others may say, I want to join for all three. We certainly encourage you to join us for all three. And at this point, Jermaine, we'll open it up to any kind of questions, reflections, or discussion.
All right. Thank you both for your presentation. So, as stated, we are now going to open it up for comments, questions, and discussion on today's topics. So, as a reminder, there are two ways to ask a question or make a comment. You can enter a question or comment using the questions window of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will read these questions out loud and in the order they are sent to us. You can also ask a question live. Here's how we will manage live questions. The vertical bar to the left of you, GoToWebinar control panel, you should see an icon that looks like a hand. This is the raised hand icon. By clicking on this icon, we can see that you have raised your hand. Then, I will unmute you and ask you to go ahead with your question or comment. Please say your name and what institution you represent, and if your question or comment is for a specific person. So as I look, we actually have, let me double check before I'm gonna say no questions. So I'll give it just a moment or two just in case you're typing now, and so I don't skip you. All right, it looks like you guys explained everything perfectly because no one has any questions.
Very good. Well, we look forward to seeing everybody again in May.
Well, wait, I spoke too soon.
All right.
Here's one. When we pay bills, they still go to CIC agency?
Yes. Church Insurance Agency sends out the billing. It's a combined bill. It will combine several policies if you have them on one bill. None of that has changed.
All right, thank you. So just in the, is the percentage deductible for hurricane on the loss or the value of the property?
Good question. The percentage deductible, which has been reduced to 2% in the mainland, is applicable based on the building and or content value.
Got it. Next question. Are church organs covered or do they need an endorsement?
Excellent question. I believe the question is probably speaking specifically about a pipe organ. The answer is yes, and then we'll talk about electric organs as well. A pipe organ is actually considered part of the building, and when we do our building appraisals, we calculate it as part of the building. It's permanently affixed, so pipe organs are considered part of the building. To add to that, it wasn't asked, but just to clarify it for other folks, stained glass windows, same way, part of the building. So we'll be reaching out to you when we appraise these buildings. We may reach out to you about the value of the stained glass if you know it. With the pipe organs, it's pretty easy to figure out the value. We can either find it online, but when we really need to know for sure, we just ask your church organist, and they always tend to know, and then we can value the organ for you. But pipe organs are part of the building. Electronic organ is a content, so it's not permanently affixed, so it is part of the building personal property or the contents coverage, and just needs to be contemplated when you're selecting your limit.
Okay, thank you. Next question. D&O insurance. I understand that it has become a common practice to sue members of your board or vestry as individuals, and they are then not covered by the D&O insurance that covers them as a member of the vestry. Is this true?
Now, they are covered under our directors and officers coverage as long as they're acting within the scope of their assignment. When you look at the insuring agreement of the D&O policy, which we'll do in the webinar in July, you'll get to see how broad that coverage is. But just to put your mind at ease, it drops down all the way to the volunteer level.
Thank you. And now the next question is, are pianos covered automatically or do they need a writer?
It's a great question. Most pianos are going to just be a content, so it's something you need to contemplate when you're setting your limit for personal property within the building. The exception to that would be if it's some sort of ornate, antique organ of special meaning, special, it's museum quality, something like that, or maybe it's a six-figure, five-figure piano. You could certainly schedule it to provide the best coverage. But the run-of-the-mill piano that we would see typically throughout a lot of the smaller churches is just a content, and we would cover it as such. But you could certainly schedule it for broader protection.
Yeah, let me add to that just quickly. So the reason you schedule is if the piano is destroyed in a fire, we're going to have you get 2 or 3 bids for something that would be like, kind, or quality. The advantage of scheduling it is that, if you've got the priceless Steinway or something that we're going to debate, the value of after the loss. The beauty of scheduling it is you're essentially adjusting the claim prior to the loss. We're agreeing that we're going to insure this for $200,000. If it's destroyed in the fire, then you get a check for $200,000. There's no kind of going to bid. The adjustment process really is already done, and we've agreed on the value of it prior to the loss rather than after the loss.
That's right.
Jermaine, are you on mute? We can't hear you.
So sorry, I definitely was. The next question that I will read to everyone and not just myself this time. What document should I look at to understand what bonding coverage we have for our treasurer, bookkeeper, Sunday counters, etc.?
Yeah, that is really why we put together this handbook. When you go and take a look at the handbook, it was designed really for the newly appointed vestry person who was talked into being the senior warden at that moment and is now thinking about property and casualty insurance and really doesn't have any background in that area. When you go to the book, there are, Paul, I think there are 9 chapters.
Yep.
When you go to the table of contents, you will see a section on crime. And when you click on that, it will take you to that section of the book. And it really goes through the basics, the description of what the coverage is, and then it will roll into kind of the basics of risk management in terms of how do you handle your money, how is it audited, how many people are counting the offering, etc. You'll start to get into the risk management tips that will make the activity a safer one for the church.
Thank you. Next question. Can you please explain the margin clause that appears in the policy?
Sure. The margin clause is, again, a bit of a safety net. We insure at 100% value for your church. So Paul has a group that takes your plat. We have your basic footprint of your church. We have software that we fill in your zip code, the type of construction, whether it's a frame or masonry, the type of roof you have, is it slate, is it asphalt shingle, what kind of heating and cooling do you have, and it gives us a figure, and let's say that figure is $1 million. We insure at 100% for that $1 million. There are no penalties for being underinsured. We've agreed with you that is $1 million for that building. Again, replacement cost, not market value, not what you can sell it for, but what it's going to cost us to rebuild it with brand new materials, like kind and quality. The margin clause is simply an additional 15% above that figure. So in the case of $1 million building, you would have 1.15 million to draw from. In addition to the margin clause, you have some things like building ordinance extensions, for example, that pick up things like code enforcement, where now you have to add a sprinkler system, or now you have to build a handicap ramp that wasn't there in order to get occupancy, etc. So it's one of those catch-alls that gives you some additional coverage in case we're off when we do our appraisals.
Thank you. Next question. Are church safety policy guides or recommendations available for parishes launching dedicated safety commissions?
There's various information. Yep, in the ebook there is some basic risk management, disaster preparation. It runs the gamut of the different exposures that is available within the ebook. I would also encourage you to reach out to your regional vice president, because we can also put you in touch with some folks who may have already done this work in other churches or other dioceses. Specifically, for example, I've seen really, really deep disaster recovery, disaster preparation work in some of the dioceses that are coastal that they will share with other coastal dioceses because they're all dealing with the same things. I've seen it in the Midwest with regard to dealing with tornadoes, things like that. So yes, the ebook has it at a basic level, again, designed for the small, medium church. As you get deeper into it, you'll want to engage with your regional vice president, who can connect you with additional resources that we may be aware of.
Yeah, I would add that, you can reach out. Paul can give you a self checklist in terms of safety, or you can have your regional vice president do the walkthrough for you. But we do have an extensive survey that goes through both the outside and inside of the property, and we look at things like loose handrails, whether the fire extinguisher's charged, is there proper lighting, etc. And then we can provide that to your safety commission to implement the changes you need to make it a safer place to worship.
Yeah, you'll find that the document that Steve's referring to, folks will call it the Episcopal Safety Program. It's about a 25-page checklist, and as Steve said, it'll take you through everything with regard to every building, every detail of the building, down to the level of things like playgrounds, parking lots, outside groups using church property, fiduciary responsibilities, safeguarding God's children. It goes through all the exposures. I think you'd find it very helpful. And what happens at the end of that, Vice President would come out, meet with you, walk through the facility, complete the report, and would later submit to you written recommendations to improve the risk management at your church.
Okay.
Jermaine, this is Bob. Could you back up the deck to the slide that has the URL for the e-handbook?
There it was.
Thank you.
All right. The next question. I received the appraisal book from American Appraisals in 2008. Will we receive that book again?
Great question. So American Appraisals was an independent appraisal company, and we had used them for a couple decades. And they would go out every 7 to 10 years, measure buildings, complete a report, and submit it to us. The cost of which was fairly expensive and, of course, ends up in one form or the other in the premium. Technology's taken us a long way. With the advent of some industry software and the Google Earth and the existing material that we already have on file for most churches, we're able to do most of these appraisals independently ourselves without incurring the additional cost, again, with an eye on premiums. We're happy to report that we're in the middle of that process. And again, if you reach out to your regional representative or just call the service center, they can give you an ETA on where we are in your diocese with regard to that. And we can certainly set up a situation where the VP can share that information with you. And what we're doing with this information, as we see it, where it's appropriate and necessary, we are making changes at the next renewal to make sure that the buildings are insured to value and communicating with the churches at that time. But yes, we're in the middle of that process now.
Thank you. Next question. Are pews and other furniture in a church or other building covered as part of the building or as personal property?
Good question. So generally the pews are going to be, when we go in and appraise a building, it's going to be part of the building. And the simplest way to think about this is if I take a building and I turn it upside down and shake it, whatever doesn't fall is part of the building. So using that as our guide, we would typically consider pews part of the building. I have seen situations where folks will have very ornate pews that have some big age on them. They're old and ornate, and you're not going to find them in a catalog. I've had folks where we put a specific value on them. I've had folks where we will schedule pews, but generally part of the building.
Got it. Last question that I see right now.
Okay.
Is it possible to request a hard copy of the book, which is often easier to use and cross-reference, or will we need to print it on our own?
It is a print-on-demand solution, so we don't have these books printed for shipment, but we provide it to you in a way that you can easily print it right at your desk, or just sections of it.
All right. That seems to be it. Let me see if anyone wants to ask a live question, or if you're still typing, I'll give you another second.
We do have a hand raised, Jermaine, for Christina Strong.
Christina, I'm not sure if you typed in your question, but we're coming for, well, oh, looks like, oh, no, you're back. Hi, Christina, you are unmuted. Christina? Okay. Okay, I see you did type in a question. Maybe that was what you wanted to know. Just in case, I'll come back. There is one more, I think. Hi, Nancy, you're unmuted. Okay, now you're self-muted. All right. And one more go for Christina.
She typed in she doesn't have a question, Jermaine.
Perfect. All right, those are all the questions we have for now. This year, we are not having the feedback poll. I can hear you, some of you out there clapping and celebrating, but we are requesting your feedback in a 4-question scaled survey, plus an additional comments box. When the webinar ends, a screen will pop up asking you to complete the survey. We truly do take into account your feedback. Thank you in advance for completing the survey. I would like to thank you for your participation and joining us for today. Thank you, members of the webinar, for giving us time in your busy schedules. Please check the webinar page in the Administrator Resource Center, or ARC, for information and registration links for upcoming webinars. Once again, please give us your feedback on the survey. This concludes the webinar.
Thank you, everyone.